It is podcast recommendation time, and this time I am going to recommend a podcast from one of my friends. And this is a podcast that I would love even if Kristen wasn't my friend, but she is. And that podcast is Murder, She Told. One of the things I love best about Kristen's show is that you are not going to hear the same cases you've heard on other podcasts. In Murder, She Told, Kristen focuses on lesser-known true crime stories, generally in New England, sometimes beyond, and they're told from the perspective of a victim's advocate. You will see this most in her work on the Reeves-Johnson case. This is a missing persons case from Kittery, Maine. It happened in 1983. And not only was she given access to the case file to make a podcast, she currently actively works on the case as new leads come in. But no case really hits quite like the Danielle Bertolini case does, and that's because Danielle was Kristen's childhood friend, and she was murdered in California in 2014. There has been no justice in that case, and Danielle's episode features an interview with her mother and with the lead detective on that case. Murder, She Told is an investigative podcast that is rooted in deep research, straightforward narratives, and the victims and their families are at the center of every story. You can learn more at murdershetold.com and search for Murder, She Told now wherever you get your podcasts. In 2012, Mickey Schunick left on her bicycle to ride home. When she vanished, over 1,000 tips came in, but it took 2 to lead to her killer. What they later learned was Mickey wasn't his first victim. I'm Charlie, and welcome to Crimelines. Welcome to Crimelines. I hope everyone's having a good week. I wanted to give a reminder/announcement that I do have a Patreon and Apple subscription account, and that allows you to get all of the Crimelines content ad-free, and there is also bonus content every month. Historically, those bonus episodes have just been like regular Crimelines episodes. What I put up there isn't really anything different than what I would do in the main feed. But then I had an idea. I have talked before about how if I made another podcast, it would be just taking the Forensic Files episodes and getting into all the details that they left out along the way with updates on the cases, because a lot of the convictions ended up being appealed and more information came out. I definitely do not have the time to do something that research intensive on top of Crimelines, but then it occurred to me that I could just take that show idea and make it my bonus content. So starting in April, the Patreon and Apple subscriber bonus content will become its own series called Beyond the Files. They'll be like Crimelines episodes in that we'll follow the timeline and they're going to be deep dives, but we're going to take a look at Forensic Files and their portrayal specifically. If you're already on Patreon or Apple subscriptions, you'll see these episodes pop up just like the bonus content always has. You don't have to change anything or move to a new tier because this will just take the place of the monthly bonus content you've always gotten. And if you're not a supporter already and want access to Beyond the Files, the links will be in the show notes. I'll be upfront, it is $5 USD a month to get 2 Beyond the Files episodes per month, plus all the Crimelines episodes ad-free. I try to keep my pricing in the affordable range because I'm not someone who will spend $15 or $20 a month on someone's Patreon, so I certainly don't expect my listeners to pay that much for mine, if that makes sense. So, with that announcement/self-promotion out of the way, let's get into this week's case. This one is a topic suggestion sent in by Tiffany, so thank you, Tiffany, for that. We are talking about Michaela Schunick, who pretty much always went by Mickey. She was born in May 1990 and grew up in Lafayette, Louisiana, with an older sister named Charlie and a younger brother named Derek. Mickey was an introspective person, a little quieter than her older sister, but still funny and outgoing in her own way. She loved horseback riding and just animals in general. After high school, she decided to stay at home and go to college locally at the University of Louisiana at Lafayette, and there she was studying anthropology. Mickey was someone who generally rode her bike everywhere she needed to go. Pretty much anywhere in Lafayette she wanted to be was within about 20 minutes or so. On Friday, May 18th, 2012, Mickey was just days away from her 22nd birthday, and she went out with friends to listen to some live music at a place called the Artmosphere Bistro. This is a small venue. It's basically a house that's been converted into an artsy bistro, and as usual, Mickey rode her bike. She was there from about 10:15 at night until 12:45 when she and another friend named Brettley left and rode about a mile to Brettley's house. They hung out there until about 1:20 in the morning when they decided to go get something to eat. There are only a few food options available at that hour, and most of them are drive-thrus, which is one thing Mickey could not do on her bike. So she and Brettley used his car to go pick up some Taco Bell, and they were seen on the security camera there at 1:24. They then went back to Brettley's house to eat, where they were when a friend called Mickey on her cell phone around 1:30. They talked for a little bit, and according to Brettley, it was about 15 minutes after this call that Mickey said she needed to go. She said she had to get some sleep because her little brother had his high school graduation the next morning. Mickey left at about 1:45, and because it was about a 4-mile ride to her house, she would have been expected to get there by about 2 a.m., but she never made it. Initially, Mickey's parents were mostly just annoyed that morning that she was running late, getting home in time for the graduation. So they left without her, assuming she would just meet them there. But the ceremony started at 11:30 and Mickey hadn't shown. It wasn't outrageous to think that Mickey was running late, but not coming at all was not like her. Calls to her cell phone went straight to voicemail, so her mom started calling around to area hospitals to see if she had been admitted somewhere. And while she did that, Mickey's older sister Charlie called Brettley, knowing that Mickey had plans with him the night before. Brettley told Charlie that Mickey had left around 1:45 and mentioned how Mickey specifically said she had to go home and get some sleep before the graduation. So as of 1:45 a.m., Mickey fully intended to be there for her brother, and she was heading home. Knowing this and not being able to find anyone who talked to Mickey after she left Brettley's house, the family called the police to report her missing. Searches began immediately with family, friends, and volunteers walking every possible path from Brettley's house to Mickey's house in the hopes of finding any clue as to where she went. The family was sure she left Brettley's because Brettley said so and they trusted him. The investigators, however, trusted no one, so they were looking into the possibility that Brettley was lying. Brettley was taken to the station for questioning, which started out normal enough with them just asking what happened that night leading up to Mickey leaving his house. But then the questions got a little pushier. They said things that were attempts to get Brettley to make some concessions. Things like, "We know accidents can happen, and maybe you panicked." Brettley stuck to his version of events. So then the investigators got more directly confrontational and downright accusatory, saying things like how Brettley was probably in love with Mickey. She was a pretty young woman. Maybe he tried something and she turned him down, and they could see how something could have escalated. But Brettley was adamant. He and Mickey were just friends, had always just been friends, and Mickey was alive and well when she left his house that night. It's not clear if the investigators believed him after his interview or not, but they definitely believed him when they pulled footage from cameras along the path from his house to Mickey's. At 1:47 and 1:48 a.m., the cameras caught Mickey riding in the direction of her house. As they checked cameras closer to her house, she didn't appear. So they knew for sure Mickey had left Brettley's house, but she wouldn't have made it even halfway home based on what they could see on the cameras. On May 21st, instead of celebrating Mickey's birthday, a prayer vigil was held in downtown Lafayette that was covered by the national media, and that helped get a lot of eyes on this case. Elizabeth Smart, who is the face of hope in situations like this, spoke with the local paper, the Daily Advertiser, encouraging the community to stay optimistic. She said that until the missing person is found, no one should give up and think they'll never come home. She encouraged the family to lean on each other's strengths so that they weren't driven apart. And lean on strengths is exactly what they did. Mickey's sister Charlie canceled her summer internship and became the spokesperson for this case. She was doing everything from organizing volunteers to doing radio interviews to making sure the social media awareness on the case was up to date and accurate with the latest information. And if you talk to any family advocate, they will tell you that keeping social media, 1, up to date and 2, accurate is a feat on its own. A few days after Mickey went missing, a big piece of information was released to the public on this case, and that was the CCTV footage of Mickey riding her bike home that night. This gave the public an idea of what she was wearing and what her bike looked like, but it also stopped the tips and the conversation on social media that was regarding Brett Lee. Just because someone was cleared by the police, it didn't mean the public wasn't still saying, have they looked into her friend? He's the last one to see her. That seems suspicious. So releasing this definitely quieted those voices. They then also released additional footage of a pickup truck and 2 cars that passed in the same area as Mickey around the same time. They were called possible witnesses, and that was certainly true of at least one car that was actually going in the opposite direction. But the truck did seem a little suspicious. It was behind Mickey and came through the intersection shortly after she did. According to some reports, it looked like its brake lights came on after it passed by the camera. The investigators could not get a plate number off the truck, but from what they could see, it was a white Chevy Silverado. Now, this is hardly an unusual or rare vehicle in southern Louisiana. However, they were able to narrow it down to the Z71 model thanks to the help from a local dealership. A big tip came in on Saturday, May 26, 2012, a week after Mickey went missing. Fishermen in the Whiskey Bay area found a bike off the I-10 bridge and, having seen the extensive reports on Mickey's disappearance, they called the police. Showing Charlie a photo of the black and gold bike, she identified it as Mickey's. The bike looked like it had been out in the swamp for a week, but more than that, the back tire was absolutely mangled. It wasn't the damage you would get from throwing it off the bridge. It looked more like it had been hit, possibly by a white Chevy Silverado. The discovery of the bike gave the searchers a new area to look, and Texas EquiSearch came in to help. But it also made the community's collective heart sink. This was a good 25 to 30 miles from where Mickey was last seen and in the opposite direction of her house. She hadn't gotten her bike out there herself. In the early days of the search, over 1,000 tips came in about white trucks or suspicious men. Rarely were the tips about both, but they did get a lead on a 19-year-old named Rocky. He drove a white truck, and more than that, he was about to go on trial for a DUI manslaughter case. Was it possible he was driving around, intoxicated, and hit Mickey? Now, worried about what that would mean for his upcoming trial, he may have decided to get rid of the evidence. Now, this was but one tip out of many that were being investigated at the same time. But this tip did leak onto social media, and it blew up. Suddenly, more tips came in about Rocky, and some even implicated his girlfriend, saying that she was with him that night. This was a really hot lead, but so many of the tips were just based on what was already being put out on social media. The one independent tip they got, the one that started all of this, that was determined to be a hoax. Either the tipster wanted attention or wanted to cause a headache for Rocky, but what they really did was waste investigators' time. By early June, the major searches had been called off. They had covered all of the key areas they knew to look, like around Brett Lee's house, the route to Mickey's house, and the Whiskey Bay area. They had come up empty-handed, so unless there was a major tip, there was little for them to do. Things seemed publicly like they were starting to slow down, but they were actually heating up, thanks to a tip that came in on June 14th, 2012. Mickey had been missing for nearly 4 weeks when a Lafayette car dealership told the police about a man who really wanted to buy a white Chevy Silverado Z71. He said he owned one, but it was stolen recently and he wanted to get another. He was insistent that it had to be that model and it had to be white. While he was there, the TV news came on with a segment about Mickey's case, and the man looked visibly nervous. The tip said that this man was named Brandon Laverne. This name caught investigators' attention because, one, it was a specific tip with information connected to a known element of the crime, and two, they had Brandon's name from another tip that came in a week earlier. The information from that tip was less directly tied to a known element of the case, which is why it wasn't a priority. But that caller, someone who knew Brandon, said that he had been acting suspiciously since Mickey went missing. That same weekend she went missing, Brandon showed up with stab wounds, having claimed he was mugged in New Orleans, even though he had no plans to go there. New Orleans is 2 hours away from Lafayette, so it's not somewhere you necessarily go without notice. So the investigators decided to run the history of Brandon's vehicle insurance. If his truck was stolen and he was ready to buy another one, he very likely got money from the insurance company. The question was his truck stolen before or after Mickey went missing? The investigators learned that Brandon did in fact file a claim on the stolen vehicle. And on it, he stated his truck was stolen in Texas between 11 p.m. on May 30th and 6 a.m. on the 31st. So not just after Mickey went missing, but after the police publicized that they were looking for that truck. The truck had been found in Texas, but it was completely burnt out. Absolutely a shell of a truck left, and no evidence could be recovered. On June 20th, the police were able to pull Brandon's phone records from the day before Mickey went missing until the day after he reported his truck stolen. And they found out that on May 18th, the night Mickey went out with her friends, Brandon called several numbers between 4:20 p.m. and 12:18 a.m. In looking up these numbers, they found that they were from advertisements for escort services. Brandon's phone then had no activity until 8:20 in the morning when he called his fiancée. And then there were also some calls that weekend to medical facilities, so the police then got a warrant for his medical records. Brandon had shown up on the morning of May 19th with stab wounds to kind of his upper back neck area, a stab wound to his chest, as well as an injury to his hand. At the time, the police were, of course, called to the hospital to take the report, and Brandon told multiple stories between what he told the nurses, what he told the police, and what he told others. The basic story was that he stopped at a gas station to ask for directions around 3 or 3:30 in the morning. One time he said it was a big white guy with gold teeth that attacked him with a knife, stealing his wallet with about $40 in it. In another version, it was actually a big black guy, and then it was 3 black men, and then the hand injury was actually not from the stabbing, but from a separate fishing incident. And, the story just never aligned. As for which gas station Brandon was when this happened, he was a bit fuzzy on this. They eventually questioned him enough to narrow it down to an area, and they found that the only gas station that fit all the elements he had told them about was one that was on South Carrollton in New Orleans. The police went out there to investigate, and the manager said he was unaware of anything happening overnight. Brandon hadn't come in, he didn't ask to use the phone to call the police, he didn't ask for an ambulance, and no one witnessed the attack. The manager let the police check the security footage, which showed nothing. The stab wounds were non-life-threatening, but the injury to Brandon's hand was bad enough that he needed surgery to repair a damaged tendon. The surgery was supposed to happen on May 25th, but he showed up and he had poison ivy, so they postponed it for a few days until it cleared up. So this man was stabbed, exposed to poison ivy, like he had been in a field or the woods, Then he had his truck stolen and torched, and all of that happened in less than 2 weeks following the disappearance of a woman who they think he was in proximity to. Now, they couldn't tell the license plate number on the truck on the cameras from the early morning of May 19th. Those dark images are too grainy, but they could make out the shape of the items in the truck bed. So they used the license plate number of Brandon's stolen truck and tried to find an earlier image of the truck on traffic cameras from when the sun was up. And they found one. They found his truck going through an intersection earlier on the 18th, and they could clearly see what was in the bed. And it all matched the shapes that you can make out in that grainy after dark footage. So they were sure this was Brandon's truck behind Mickey. And now he could have just been a witness if not for the other suspicious circumstances around him, like the stab wounds and the stolen truck. And I guess I haven't mentioned the other thing. They pulled Brandon's record and learned he was a registered sex offender. Back in April of 1999, Brandon, who was 20 at the time, broke into the home of someone he knew and raped her. She said she was in bed and he blindfolded her and bound her wrists. Brandon initially told the police that the incident was consensual and she had invited him over. However, in February of 2000, Brandon pleaded guilty to aggravated oral sexual battery in a plea deal, and he was sentenced to 10 years in prison, of which he would serve just over 8. His wife, who was a couple months pregnant when he went to prison, divorced him and moved out of the area with their child. When Brandon was released, he was required to register as a sex offender. In Louisiana at the time, due to a 2006 law, Brandon's driver's license had to have a stamp on it indicating that he was a sex offender. And this stamp was not subtle. It's not like the little checkbox for being an organ donor or the indicator that you need glasses while driving. It was orange, all capital letters saying sex offender right under the photograph. This law has since been struck down, but in 2012, Brandon would have that stamp on his license, where he should have had it. He certainly didn't want it on there, and he was accused of once offering a DMV worker $500 to not print the license with the stamp on it. And the police learned that he had altered his license in some way to remove it. They learned this because they had a record of a mobile home purchase from earlier in the year, and the seller had photocopied his ID, which did not have the stamp on it. Removing the stamp was enough cause to pull over 33-year-old Brandon Laverne and detain him, which they did on Thursday, July 5th, 2012. He refused to speak to the police, saying he wanted a lawyer. And they then booked him on the charges of first-degree murder and kidnapping in Mickey's case. Shortly after the arrest, the investigators contacted Brandon's half-sister in Texas, who lived in the same area his truck had, allegedly, been stolen from. And she decided she would go ahead and tell the police what she knew. She said Brandon had come to her house to visit and told her he needed to burn his truck and then report it missing. And that's because he got wrapped up in something criminal in Louisiana. It's not clear if he said it was weapons related, but that's definitely the impression she got from whatever it was he did say. And she agreed to help him. She followed him to the spot where he torched his truck and then drove him back to her house. Brandon then reported the truck stolen in the morning and got a rental car before driving back home. So this confirmed what the investigators already suspected, and that was that Brandon was the one who destroyed his truck. And they believed he did so to get rid of evidence in Mickey's case. Also, after Brandon's arrest, they searched his home and his new truck. And in that new truck, they found an envelope with a Mickey's mother's phone number written on it, which was odd. It doesn't sound like they could find evidence that he tried to contact the family, but it showed he was, to some degree, paying attention to the case. And then, in Brandon's home, they found 2 wallets with identification of other people and a suitcase with the ID tag that was for a woman. At this point, they were wondering if they had a serial killer on their hands. and they investigated these people as possible victims. They learned that the owner of one of the wallets was already deceased, and the suitcase had been donated to Brandon after he lost everything in a house fire earlier in the year. That's why he had to purchase a new mobile home and used an altered ID to do so that then got him picked up by the police. But they were able to confirm that the woman who owned the suitcase was alive and well. So that left them with one wallet, and they were unable to locate that person. We'll go ahead and call her Susan. They were able to get in touch with Susan's brother, though, and he said that he hadn't seen her in a few months. She had been living with him, but they had issues and she moved out. He still put money in her bank account to help her, but she was not returning his calls. So he decided to stop putting money in the account with the idea that this would push Susan into reaching out to make contact. But it didn't. And then he found out that she hadn't been touching the bank account. Though I changed her name, her real name did leak out, and it's probably a good thing it did. It's interesting, this case has a name that leaks that turned out to be a bad thing and one that turns out to be a good thing. Some online sleuths took the name of the woman, did some online searches, and they found a very brief and somewhat obscure mention of her working on a production in the area that she lived in. They passed the info on to the police, who were able to make contact and confirm that Susan was alive and well. It turned out her purse had been stolen, so she was a victim, but not of murder. However, it turned out there was another murder victim in Brandon's past. When Mickey's case went to the grand jury and Brandon was indicted on July 18th, 2012, he was also indicted in the murder of Lisa Pate, someone the Schunick family had never heard of. Lisa Pate was 34 years old in 1999 when her family last heard from her. She was someone who lived a bit on the fringes, dealing with drug addiction, so the family wasn't entirely sure when she was last seen. They could place it at late June or early July 1999. That was about the time she stopped showing up for visits with her minor children. Like a lot of people dealing with substance abuse, Lisa had a pattern of getting sober and relapsing, getting sober and relapsing. She attended at least 2 rehabs, but she couldn't kick her habit for good. It appears she was living in hotels at the time of her disappearance. Lisa's family reported her missing and had their family attorney doing some media pushes to ask for tips. Then on Tuesday, September 21st, 1999, so a few months after she went missing, a man named Gus and a few friends were hanging out in his backyard. He and his girlfriend had recently moved into the rental house, and so Gus decided to explore part of the overgrown patch of the property. After following a trail through that area, he saw 3 boards lying on the ground. He lifted one and saw a skull. He called the police, and based on dental comparison, the body was identified as Lisa Pate. Brandon ended up being a suspect in Lisa's case before Mickey even went missing. He had grown up in the area, and he knew the people who had been living in the house at the time Lisa went missing, so before Gus and his girlfriend had moved in. Multiple people said Brandon confessed that he had killed her, including inmates who served time with him, and including someone Brandon had been allegedly stalking since high school. This woman, who we will call Jill, told the police she was terrified of Brandon. He had been a bully from middle school until he dropped out of high school. It was a relief to her that he left school and would hopefully leave her alone. But at some point in Jill's later teen years, she won a local beauty pageant, and somehow that just put her back on Brandon's radar. She has made some pretty heavy accusations against him, though I don't see that any of this was prosecuted or dealt with legally. She said he would follow her around town, he showed up at her house with a gun, and he made threatening phone calls, which were recorded, and based on the investigative report linked in my show notes, these were turned over to the police at the time. Jill obviously didn't see or hear from him from February 2000 when he went to prison until April of 2008 when he was released. According to her, he showed up at her house 2 days after he got out. and her husband chased him off the property. Jill told the police that the last time she saw Brandon was in June of 2012, about a month after Mickey disappeared. She was outside with her daughter, and Brandon just showed up. She grabbed her daughter and got in the car, but the window was still rolled down, so Brandon tried to reach in like he was going to hug her. She was able to drive off without incident. Jill said over the years she heard that Brandon had confessed to killing Lisa and that he confessed to cutting the brake lines on a car that she was in. There was a crash and the other person was killed and Jill was seriously injured. But everything Jill knew about this was hearsay. She didn't hear Brandon say any of these things herself. But Brandon was enough of a suspect in Lisa's murder that prior to him being released from prison in 2008, they convened a grand jury and presented the evidence against him for Lisa Pate's murder. The grand jury at that time declined to indict. So this was the second time Lisa's case was presented to the grand jury, and this time they did indict 33-year-old Brandon Laverne for both Lisa's murder and Mickey's. On July 27th, he pleaded not guilty in both cases, and the next hearing would not even be scheduled until October when the filings were due. So both families settled in for what they thought was going to be a long trial process. That all changed a week and a half later on August 7th. The police said they had a credible tip as to the location of Mickey Schunick's body, and some very observant journalists noted that Brandon had been signed out of lockup for 9 hours that day. So before it was officially confirmed, it was widely assumed that Brandon had talked. About an hour north of Lafayette, Brandon led investigators to the woods behind an old private cemetery. There they found the buried remains of Mickey Schunick. Formal identification took a few days, but the source of the information was her killer, so the family knew it was her. In a plea deal that took the death penalty off the table, Brandon had agreed to confess to both the murders of Mickey Schunick and Lisa Pate, as well as lead investigators to the recovery of Mickey's remains. In the case of Lisa Pate, Brandon said he met her around June of 1999 while she was living at a hotel. He invited her to come stay with him, which was a house outside of Lafayette. After a few days together, Lisa told him that she wanted to go visit her kids and asked if she could take his vehicle. He said no. So then she asked if he would drive her back to Lafayette, and he said no to that as well. So Lisa was at this house with a guy who was refusing to bring her back to her family, and they weren't in a place where she could reasonably walk home. So she waited until Brandon fell asleep and tried to sneak out the door with his keys, but he caught her. In a rage, Brandon beat, strangled, and then suffocated Lisa with a plastic bag before hiding her remains behind his acquaintance's house. Now, Brandon's confession did align with the evidence. Though it was held back at the time, Lisa's face had multiple fractures, and plastic was found around her skull. But we have to remember that this story, and the one he would tell about Mickey, are really just his versions, and in my opinion, he has motivation to downplay what happened. In this case, he was provoked by Lisa trying to steal his vehicle. And then he would claim a provocation of sorts with Mickey as well. Brandon said he was driving around that night and had been drinking. He got hungry, so he headed to a fast food restaurant. While he was driving and playing on his phone, he said he saw something out of the corner of his eye, and it was Mickey on her bike. He tried to brake, but he ended up hitting her back tire. Brandon said he immediately got out of his truck, apologizing to Mickey while she was pretty upset. Somehow the two pretty quickly came to an agreement not to call the police over the incident. In his confession, he said that he didn't want the police called because he had a gun in the truck, and he wasn't allowed to have a firearm as a convicted felon. He said Mickey didn't want the police because she indicated to him that she had drugs on her. And by drugs, at most he means pot. At the time, though, all marijuana, even medical, was illegal in Louisiana. Anyway, according to Brandon, they agreed to settle it between themselves, and he offered to give Mickey a ride home as her bike was unrideable. Mickey hesitated to accept this ride, but then decided to go with him. So they put her bike in the back, and she got into the cab with him. As Brandon drove her home, he said he offered her $100 for the damage. Mickey countered that it was a $500 bike, but Brandon said it was just the tire that was messed up and $100 was perfectly reasonable. The two started going back and forth, and Mickey finally said she was going to call the police. Brandon said he stopped the truck and told her to get out, but she refused, saying that he would just take off with her bike in the bed of his truck. Mickey reached for her cell phone, and Brandon said he panicked and grabbed a knife. He told her he wasn't playing around and not to call the cops. Brandon said he realized at that moment that he had screwed up by overreacting and told Mickey he was sorry and that he'd just give her the $500 and drop her off at home. So he put the knife down on the console so it was in plain view to let Mickey know she didn't have anything to worry about. He was about to start driving again when Mickey sprayed him with the mace she always carried with her. He tried to get the can of mace away from her, and she grabbed the knife and stabbed him. He said he got the knife away from her and stabbed her a few times, and she then slid to the floor of the truck. Brandon said he thought about taking her to the hospital, but he didn't know how he was going to explain what happened. He checked her pulse and couldn't detect it. So he pulled out his gun, and he considered shooting himself because he just could not face going back to prison. The next bit in his memory was fuzzy. It seems he was driving around, and at one point he tried to take Mickey's body out to a field, and he planned to leave her along a tree line. He pulled over and sat there for a second when, according to him, Mickey popped up, stabbed him in the chest, and then he shot her in the head. Brandon said he was so freaked out that he just drove to his house with Mickey's body in the truck. He started cleaning the blood off himself and getting changed into clean clothes. He said that while he was doing this, he just kept going back in the truck to see if Mickey's body was there because he really couldn't believe what had happened. He said he was still contemplating suicide, but he had one child already and another on the way, and he couldn't go through with it. He thought about an old cemetery he knew about from when he was in the Army and stationed at Fort Polk, so he grabbed a shovel and drove out there. But because of the wounds he had, the ones Mickey inflicted, he couldn't dig, so he just covered her body with branches before going home. He cleaned his truck and then drove back through the area where he had hit Mickey to see if the police had shown up. When he didn't see anything, he went back home. Realizing he was pretty badly injured, Brandon called a friend and said he had been stabbed in a fight. And he put the stabbing incident as happening in New Orleans, and he went to a hospital out there because it gave him a bit of an alibi. As he drove towards New Orleans, he realized he still had Mickey's bike in the bed of his truck, so he threw it off the bridge. A few days after Mickey's death, Brandon went back to where her body was in order to bury it. When he learned that his truck was spotted on the CCTV, he destroyed it in Texas, hoping the investigators in Louisiana wouldn't find out about it. He then wanted to buy the same exact truck, and it seems like he thought this would throw everyone off the trail. No one in his life would notice that he got rid of a white truck because he just replaced it with a nearly identical one. And if the police came around because of his white truck, he could say, "Oh no, I just bought it." That's Brandon's story, and while some of what he said aligns with the evidence, there are parts that we can't know. Like, did he really hit Mickey unintentionally? Did she really get in the car with him willingly? Did she mace him and stab him while he was about to drive her home, or was there another reason she felt the need to defend herself? We don't know, and we can't know, because the only person who lived to tell the tale has incentive to downplay what he did. But when someone has killed 2 people and claims some type of provocation both times, I have to wonder about the reliability of his statements, because most people are never provoked to kill anyone, let alone 2 times. Prior to making his official guilty plea in court, Brandon did have a psychological exam to make sure he was competent to take this deal. Most of the report relied on Brandon's self-report, where he said he had a troubled childhood with an abusive father and a teenage babysitter who molested him repeatedly when he was preschool age. As a teenager, he was treated for anger and depression with a 30-day inpatient hospital stay. The psychologist found that Brandon was competent to make this plea, and though he was impulsive and indulgent, he didn't have significant mental illness. On Friday, August 17th, 2012, Brandon Laverne pleaded guilty to both murders and was sentenced to life in prison. Afterwards, Mickey's mother, Nancy, released a statement saying that her courageous child had faced down a monster, and she was in awe of Mickey's strength in fighting him. With Brandon having killed 2 women in 13 years, there were investigations into if there were other victims, either prior to Brandon going to prison in February of 2000 or after his release in April of 2008. And one of those cases looked into was that of Allie Lowitzer, a 16-year-old who went missing from Spring, Texas in 2010. Brandon had family in that area, and one witness said Allie had been talking to someone in a white truck on the afternoon of her disappearance. Some reports say that the white truck that Brandon owned at the time matched the partial license plate that the tipster had remembered. Brandon was interviewed in the case, but he denied any involvement. He said he was in Louisiana at the time, and this has apparently been backed up by his employer. Brandon didn't have the type of job that he could just take off from unnoticed. He was working offshore at the time. So if he was out on an oil rig, he would have needed a boat to have gotten back to land. Next month, I'm going to cover Allie's case in detail, so we'll get into the other tips and leads in that case in April. Brandon has not confessed to any more murders and likely will not. I say that because he has tried to appeal his plea and sentence repeatedly, saying he was pressured into pleading guilty due to pretrial publicity and the fear of the death penalty. But the courts have continued to deny him since he has, in their opinion, yet to show that he has any constitutional right that was violated. That's the only way he can legally reverse his situation. The most recent denial was in 2023. Brandon's denial in 2018, though, is the one that has gotten the most publicity because he attempted to escape from Angola prison shortly after. According to prison officials, he tried to make a run for it at 4:30 in the morning on October 15th, 2018, but he never even made it to the fence before he was stopped without incident. Angola is one of those prisons that is known for being hard to escape from. It's not Alcatraz, but it is huge, and it has alarms that go off anytime there's an issue, and it's also in a remote, swampy area, so even if you get outside the fence, where are you going? After this escape attempt, the station KATC got Brandon's records from Angola to see if he's been in trouble before. Now, getting into trouble in prison is really easy. You can get written up for pretty much anything, but there was something that stood out to me in what was reported. He got in trouble for repeatedly trying to contact one of the victim's family members. He was told not to contact them, so he sent letters to his family to ask them to give them to the people he wasn't supposed to be contacting. If the victim's family doesn't want contact with the confessed killer of their loved one, just leave them alone. In addition to Brandon's attempts to appeal his guilty plea and life sentences, he did submit several court filings for a variety of issues. Most of the suits were filed in 2013 and then immediately appealed when they were denied in 2014. There are some outside of this time frame, but the majority were in this block. From late June 2013 until early July, he filed, by my count, 22 lawsuits. Brandon has an IQ of 116, which is above average. I almost wonder if he was bored, and this is what stimulated his brain as he adjusted to prison. He has attempted to sue various people connected to the case, like investigators and witnesses. He tried to sue the appellate judges for civil rights violations. And he tried to sue a private website for civil rights violations, except private websites aren't agents of the state, so that didn't go anywhere. There's only one lawsuit I really wanted to talk about for a minute, and that is when he sued Dateline. Dateline aired an episode on this case called Missing Mickey, really showcasing the work her sister Charlie did to look for her and how much the community rallied. But obviously, it also covered Brandon Laverne, and he did not like how he was portrayed. I, of course, had to double-check what facts I got from Dateline as one of my sources against his claims of defamation. For something to be defamatory, it has to be untrue. So these are the things Brandon claimed were in the Dateline episode that were lies. The first was the reporting on his use of escort services. I did not include that except to say he was calling such services that night, and that is according to the police document, which is linked in my sources, so take it up with them. The second untruth, according to Brandon, was that Dateline claimed he was in close pursuit of Mickey prior to her murder. Now that feels like an interpretation or a characterization of the events. How close is close? And he claimed he wasn't pursuing her at all and hitting her was unintentional, but that's definitely not what everyone thinks happened. This is a bit of a gray area. In this episode, I decided to just stick with his confession as he told it, but also pointing out that he had some motivation to make himself look better. The third complaint in this suit was that Dateline said Brandon seduced women and had multiple girlfriends at the time. I left that claim out of this episode because it was really irrelevant to the case, in my opinion. I used to try to shoehorn in every little detail I learned about a case and the people who were involved, but I've gotten a lot better at leaving things out that are really besides the point. I don't know, nor do I care how many girlfriends Brandon had. The fourth supposed falsehood was the implication that because Brandon committed the murders of 2 women, that could lead one to conclude that he killed other women. Now, this one I did do, but it's factual that the police looked into other potential victims after his arrest. So I'm not saying we can say for certainty that he killed anyone else, but I am saying it's worth looking into, and the police agreed. So again, take it up with them. The fifth allegedly defamatory statement was the conclusion made that Mickey's murder was brutal. This is so subjective, and I'll just go ahead and leave it up to my listeners to decide if being stabbed multiple times and then shot in the head is brutal or not. The sixth issue raised was that they talked about Brandon's impairment from drugs and/or alcohol on the night Mickey was murdered. According to his own statement to the police, he was drinking. So I'm not sure where the issue is here. If there is a complaint about someone reporting on that, then Brandon needs to take it up with himself. Now, the final thing he objected to was Dateline referring to his, quote, dark side. And there really isn't much to say on this one, except Dateline's writers like to use a little bit more flair than I do. Now, in the same suit, Brandon also accused Dateline of theft when they showed pictures from his computer and his iPhone, as well as his driver's license. He was basically saying they stole his intellectual property. And he claimed a civil rights violation. But again, Dateline and NBC are not government entities. They are private companies. So that was quickly dismissed. As for the defamation claims, some of the statements were connected to the case that he pleaded guilty on. So the court ruled that they couldn't be defamatory until they were proven untrue by having his conviction reversed, which it wasn't. And on any of the others, even if they were untrue, the amount they could damage the reputation of a convicted sex offender and twice convicted murderer was so small. When your reputation is essentially on the floor, the potential damages is so low, the amount he'd be entitled to would be nominal. Brandon strongly disagreed. He argued he was entitled to $10,000 per image shown, $500,000 for mental anguish, $1 million for libel and slander, and then punitive damages of $10 million. and Dateline should have to retract the episode. When the lower court dismissed his claim, he did appeal, but obviously he didn't win since I watched the episode a full 10 years later. The appellate court didn't even write their own analysis when affirming the lower court's decision. They just wrote that they accepted the previous court's analysis as factual. The thing with Brandon's lawsuits is that not all of them were frivolous or legally barred from proceeding. Some of them actually raised good points. Like he said he was denied his CPAP machine in lockup, which is a medical issue, and the medical care received by inmates is something that needs more public awareness. And he had other things in there, like how his mail, including legal mail, was being limited. And then there were issues of being able to have visits with his daughter. Those are issues Brandon could have, if he put his mind to it, advocated for from behind bars, and they would have helped more people beyond himself. But they mostly got ignored because he has so many filings of all of these claims and trying to sue his ex-wife for defamation for something she said to the police and things like that. It got all mixed in there, and so it got no attention. Had he chosen to do so, if he focused up, he could have done some good with his intelligence. And maybe someday he will. Because at 45 years old and with 2 life sentences ahead of him, it definitely looks like he has plenty of time to do so. Thank you for listening. If you want more content, check out my other show, Crimelines and Consequences, wherever you get your podcasts. I also offer bonus content and ad-free listening at patreon.com/crimelines or through the Apple Podcast app. If you want to buy me a coffee, the official drink of Crimelines, you can give a one-time donation at basement4productions.com/support.
Grand Canyon University's RN to BSN online degree program makes earning your bachelor's in nursing possible. Balance online coursework with local in-person clinicals to position yourself for potential leadership opportunities in the time you have from wherever you are, leaving room for what matters. Achieve your goals with your personalized plan and team behind you. Find your purpose at Grand Canyon University. Visit gcu.edu.